It's Radio Aryan at radioaryan.com.
Hello and welcome to 100 Facts About Race. You're listening to me, Sven Longshanks, and this is an article that can be found in various places online. It doesn't appear to actually have any credits associated with it. It's basically 100 facts about the differences between race, and I may add some commentary of my own to it. And it begins with a quote from Senator Bilbo. Quote, "If our buildings, our highways and our railroads should be wrecked, we could rebuild them. If our cities should be destroyed, out of the very ruins we could erect newer and greater ones. Even if our armed might should be crushed, we could rear sons who would redeem our power. But if the blood of our white race should become corrupted and mingled with the blood of Africa, then the present greatness of the United States of America would be destroyed, and all hope for civilization would be as impossible for a Negroid America as would be redemption and restoration of the white man's blood, which had been mixed with that of the Negro." Close quote. Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi in 1947. Fact number 1. The white race has crossed seas, harnessed rivers, carved mountains, tamed deserts, and colonized the most barren ice fields. It has been responsible for the invention of the printing press, cement, the harnessing of electricity, flight, rocketry, astronomy, the telescope, space travel, firearms, the transistor radio, television, the telephone, the light bulb, photography, motion pictures, the phonograph, the electric battery, the automobile, the steam engine, railroad transportation, the microscope, computers, and millions of other technological miracles. It has discovered countless medical advances, incredible applications, and scientific progress. Its members have included such greats as Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Homer, Tacitus, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, William the Conqueror, Marco Polo, Washington, Jefferson, Hitler, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Magellan, Columbus, Cabot, Edison, Graham Bell, Pasteur, Leeuwenhoek, Mendel, Darwin, Newton, Galileo, Watt, Ford, Luther, Da Vinci, Poe, Tennyson, and thousands upon thousands of other notable achievers. Fact number 2. Throughout 6,000 years of recorded history, the black African Negro has invented nothing. Not a written language, a weaved cloth, a calendar, a plough, a road, a bridge, a railway, a ship, a system of measurement, or even the wheel. Note, now this is in reference to the pure-blooded Negro. He is not known to have ever cultivated a single crop or domesticated a single animal for his own use, although many powerful and docile beasts abounded around him. His only known means of transporting goods was on the top of his head. For shelter he never progressed beyond the common mud hut, the construction of which a beaver or muskrat is capable. Now I'll interject here because you may say, well, what about the Maasai? Don't they have domesticated cows? Well, yes, they do use domesticated cows, but they were domesticated by white people. They're then taken to Africa by mixed Arab people, which is where these Negroes got the cows from in the first place, the domesticated cows. The Maasai themselves, they don't live in these mud huts. They actually live in dung huts. They make their houses out of cow shit. Other people may point out that in Ethiopia you've got these very well built African architecture, again, of these mud buildings, but they were built by mongrels. They were built by mulattoes. You can look back at what I believe it's Strabo had to write about Ethiopia back in 30 BC, and he talks about there being civilized white people there, very much like the Greeks, and complete savages who were completely uncivilizable, that they couldn't even grow hair. They grew wool, and they used whatever it was that grew on their heads in the same way that white people would use the wool from sheep. And they dug around in the ground for whatever it is they could find to eat, and they were as far removed from the civilized white man as could possibly be. So I think that counteracts any criticisms people may have of saying that the Negro never invented anything, never domesticated animals, and lives in mud huts. Fact number 3, intelligence. The IQ of American Negroes are from 15 to 20 points on average below those of American whites. And that's quite a well-known fact there. Fact number 4. These black-white differences have been demonstrated repeatedly by every test ever conducted by every branch of the US military, every state, every county and local school board, the US Department of Education. The same ratio of difference has held true over a 40-year period. Fact number 5. With an average IQ of 85, only 16% of blacks score over 100, while half the white population does. The Negro overlap of white median IQs ranges from 10 to 25%, and equality would require 50%. What that is saying is that whites are on average far more intelligent than blacks. Obviously you might get an exception to the rule, you might get the odd intelligent black, but what we're talking about here is averages. And the Negroes in Africa have an even lower IQ. And in order to prove that, Professor J.P. Rushton went over to Africa and he tested the most intelligent ones. He went to the university there and IQ tested the most intelligent Negroes he could find, and their average IQ was still 70. And you may say, well, if you have a white person with an IQ of 70, they would be retarded. And yet these Negroes don't act retarded. They're sociable. Sometimes they're more sociable than white people. So how is this? Well, this is because the Negro is supposed to have this low IQ. He can get by with that, whereas white people are not supposed to be stupid. We're supposed to be intelligent, which is, of course, why it's such a shame what's going on at the moment of lowering our IQ and mingling our blood with these Negroes and turning our people into idiots. Fact number 6. Blacks are 6 times as likely to have IQs of 50 to 70, which put them in the slow learner or retarded category, while whites are 10 times more likely to score 130 or over. Fact number 7. The US government's PACE examination, given to 100,000 university graduates who are prospective professional or administrative civil service employees each year, is passed with a score of 70 or above by 58% of the whites who take it, but by only 12% of the Negroes. Of course, this is why they keep asking for more affirmative action or reverse discrimination. Because these Negroes can't actually make the grade, they demand that they should just be allowed to have the job or pass the examination purely because of the colour of their skin. Which, if that isn't racism, then I don't know what is. Among top scorers, the difference between Negro and white performance is even more striking. 16% of the white applicants make scores of 90 or above, while only 1/5 of 1% of all Negro applicants score as high as 90. That is a white to black success rate of 80 to 1. Fact number 8. Differences between Negro and white children increase with chronological age, the gap in performance being largest at the high school and college levels. Now, this is often a cause of why mudsharks will believe that their little niglet is in actual fact a child genius, because the niglet is so much more cleverer than the other kids in the class. And this is because the Negro matures at a faster rate than the white children. So at an early age, the niglet will appear to be so much more brighter than his school friends. But by the time he gets to about 10 or 11, then the Negro doesn't continue to mature past that stage, which is why Negroes tend to be very childish, because after they get to about that age, that's it. They no longer improve in intelligence, and they stay at that level. And the child genius of the mudshark turns out to be a gangster thug with an IQ of 75. Fact number 9. White Negro IQ differences are constantly excused as the results of environmental variations, but at least 5 studies have attempted to equate socio-economic backgrounds of the two races, and they indicate no significant change in relative results. As the environment improves, the Negro does do better, but so does the white. The gap is not decreased. In fact, extensive research by D.R.G.J. McGurk, Associate Professor of Psychology at Villanova University, reveals that the gap in intelligence between blacks and whites increases where socio-economic levels of both races are raised to the middle classes. So when the Negroes are better off and they've got a little bit more money, they don't actually tend to do any better, they just tend to be even more lazy. And the gap increases between blacks and whites. Fact number 10. In 1915, Dr. G.W. Ferguson took 1,000 schoolchildren in Virginia, divided them into 5 racial categories, and tested them for mental aptitude. On average, full-blooded Negroes scored 69.2% as high as whites. 3/4 Negroes scored 73% as high as whites. 1/2 Negroes scored 81.2% as high as whites, and 1/4 Negroes scored 91.8% as high as whites. All of these blacks lived as and considered themselves as Negroes. Their environments and advantages or disadvantages were exactly the same. So what that is saying is that the more white blood that these Negroes have in them, the higher their IQ is. I would suggest this is probably one of the reasons why some white slave masters bred with their black slaves. So the resulting offspring could be more versatile, used for more different jobs basically around the farm. Fact number 11. Results of the Army beta test given by the US Army to over 386,000 illiterate soldiers in World War I showed Negro draftees to be inferior to the whites on all types of tests used in the Army. Additional tests were conducted upon pure Negroes, mulattoes and quadroons, and it was found that the lighter groups made better scores. Of course, it's whenever you see these magic Negroes that are put on television trying to tell us that they're just like whites, there will always be the light-skinned ones. You will never see any of the jet black ones being interviewed or being put forward as an example of Negro intelligence, because it's only the ones that are mixed with white blood that are capable of being put on the television. I mean, all the time that you will see that there's a Negro actor that's put on a talk show and that has to read a newspaper or discuss the news, and they just can't do it. Not to the standard that white people can do it anyway. Fact number 12. Studies conducted with identical twins raised apart in radically different environments provide conclusive evidence that overall influence of heredity exceeds that of environment in a ratio of about 3 to 1. Again, this is age relevant. Up until about the age of 18, the environment is very important. But each decade after that, you regress further and further towards your family influence, and your genetic influence becomes more important. So by about the time when you get to 40, your environmental influence counts for very, very little. It's all about your genetic heritage. Fact 13. Even when blacks and whites have the same backgrounds, in terms of family income and childhood advantages, blacks still have average IQ scores 12 to 15 points lower than comparable whites. And this includes cases where black children have been adopted by white parents. So they have had these ones that have been adopted by white parents. They've been given everything that white children have, probably even more by these cuckolded white parents. Their IQs may be improved by environment, but they are still closer to their biological parents than their adoptive parents. So even when the black parent has given them up as a baby, and these niglets have been brought up by white parents all their lives, their IQs will still be determined by their original black parents, not their adoptive cuckolded parents. Fact 14. Egalitarian ideologists often discount IQ test results with the excuse that they are culturally biased. Nonetheless, no one, not the NAACP, nor the United Negro College Fund, nor the NEA, have been able to develop an intelligence test which shows blacks and whites scoring equally. And I would say that, how can you say that IQ tests are culturally biased? A lot of them don't even use language. It's all visual. It's all visual puzzles and solving these visual puzzles. The test that J.P. Rushton devised when he went to the African universities, that didn't use language. That was all visual shapes. Testing abstract thought, basically abstract reasoning. Finding solutions. Fact 15. American Indians, who often live in conditions far worse than American blacks during their entire lives, still consistently outscore them on IQ tests. And don't forget, American Indians, obviously they are lighter skinned than the Negroes. American Indians themselves have a lot of white blood in them. The American Indian is not a pure race. They never have been pure. They've always been a Mongolized race, a mixture of the various races that have colonized America over the last 10,000 years. Fact 16. The offspring of interracial marriages tend to have lower IQs than the white parent. Well, I would say that's just going to be obvious, isn't it, that they're going to have a lower IQ, because half the genetic material comes from a race with a lower IQ. So you can't have something, you can't create something which has more than the sum of its two halves, and the two halves, one of these halves is going to be of a lower sum than the other, obviously. Next subject is the Negro brain. Fact 17. Among human races, numerous studies have been made of the comparative weight of white and Negro brains, with results that fell within the range of about an 8 to 12% lower weight for the Negro brain. Such studies have been conducted by Bean, Pearl, Avint, Tilney, Gordon, Todd, and others. Fact 18. In addition to the difference in brain weight, the Negro brain grows less after puberty than the white. Though the Negro brain and nervous system mature faster than the white brain, its development is arrested at an earlier age, which limits further intellectual advancement. And that's what I was referring to earlier about when they seem to have a higher IQ when they are younger. Fact 19. The thickness of the supragranular layer, the outside layer, of the Negro brain is about 15% thinner, and its convolutions are fewer and more simple on average than that of the white brain. Fact 20. The frontal lobes of the Negro brain, responsible for abstract conceptual reasoning, are smaller relative to body weight, less fissured and less complex than those of the white brain. Now, when you think about this, these fissures are basically a curvature on the brain. These lines that you see on the brain, that actually makes up more outer mass to the brain. So, where white brains have more fissures, there's obviously more brain there than there is with the Negroes. And you can also see the size of the Negro brain just by looking at the skull of the Negro, and it's tiny. That little space at the top there that their brain fits into. It's very similar to the gorilla. When you look at the shape of the gorilla, that just has a small space at the top for the brain. Next up, anthropology. Fact 21. The name Homo sapien was first used by the 18th century Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus. The word sapien means wise. The name was originally used to speak of the white man and synonymous with Europaeus. As a result, many later taxonomists and geneticists believed that Negroes and other races should be classified as different species. In fact, Darwin declared in The Descent of Man that the varieties of mankind are so distinct that similar differences found in any other animal would warrant their classification in different species, if not different genera. In fact, before then, I think there was Homo superior and Homo inferior. Fact 22. For his mammoth work, The Origin of Races, Professor Carlton Kuhn, president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, and the premier geneticist of the world at the time, assembled massive evidence from geography, anatomy, genetics, physiology, comparative dentition, linguistics, archaeology, and fossil records from 300 bone-bearing sites to verify his theory of pre-sapien raciation. In other words, Homo erectus was divided by race even before evolution into the Homo sapien stage. So what that is saying for those of us who believe in evolution is that bipeds were divided by race even before the what we call the white race today was around, before we even got any evidence of the white race. The bipeds of the earth were divided by race. Fact 23. According to Dr. Kuhn, while the Caucasoid subspecies, the white race, was evolving in Europe, the Negro race was standing still on the evolutionary plane and is today no less than 200,000 years behind the European in skull and brain development. Of course, I don't believe in evolution. I don't think the Negro is ever going to develop into a white man. I believe he's an entirely separate species. So there would be no need for him to advance. He is what he is, and of course he hasn't evolved. There's been no change in the Negro from when the Egyptians were writing about them 3,000 years ago. Fact 24. The Negro's skull, in addition to having a smaller brain volume and thicker cranial bones than that of the white, is prognathous, i.e., the lower face projects forward rather in the manner of an animal's muzzle. In consequence, the Negro jaw is substantially longer relative to its width than the white jaw. A feature of the Negro lower jaw is its retention of a vestige of the simian shelf, a bony region immediately behind the incisors. The simian shelf is a distinguishing characteristic of apes, and it is absent in whites. Of course, there are many similarities between the great apes and the Negro. And another one to do with the jaw is the number of teeth that Negroes have. It is not uncommon for them to have 2 to 4 extra teeth than the amount of teeth that white people have. Of course, many of our listeners may have noticed the teeth of Negroes, great big odd-looking teeth that they have, and sometimes it looks like they've actually got a problem actually fitting these teeth into the jaw, especially if it's a mulatto. And that's because the Negroes can have 4 more teeth than white people. So if you've got a mixed race kid, and it's got rather a lot of white genes there, and then it's got Negro teeth, and these Negro teeth aren't going to fit into the white jaw, you're going to have serious problems. This is why these mulattoes end up having these really ugly teeth and ugly jaws. And of course the caricatures that are drawn of them highlight this fact. Fact 25. The skin of the Negro is thicker and possibly superior to the whites in the way it impedes the penetration of germs and in its protection from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. I would say that's because it's not skin, it's a hide. They were never intended to wear clothes. They have no need to wear clothes. The only reason they do wear clothes is to protect the modesty of the white man. Fact 26. The dark colour of the Negro is due to melanin pigment, which is spread through every layer of the skin and is found even in the muscles and the brain. This dark pigment is everywhere, absolutely everywhere, soaks its way throughout the entire body, and it can never be got rid of. 9th to the 10th generation of mulattoes are still going to have this pigment in them. It does not wash out. Fact 27. An African dentist can tell a Negro's tooth from a white man's at a glance. Fact 28. Negroes have arms which are longer relative to body height than those of whites. This feature, together with their much thicker cranial bones, gives black athletes an advantage over whites in boxing. The skeletal and muscular peculiarities of Negroes' lower limbs have given them considerable success as sprinters, but have left them relatively undistinguished as distance runners. And this difference in bodily proportions is also going to lead to problems when you have clothing that's supposedly one size fits all. You've got Negroes with longer legs than white people and shorter chests than white people. Shirts aren't going to fit. Trousers aren't going to fit. And yet they still sell one size fits all clothing. Now I think the more we have Negroes in our countries, the less it is going to be likely that we're going to be able to find clothing that actually fits us correctly without going to a bespoke tailor. Something which we all would have done for ourselves years ago. Anyway, that finishes part additional differences. And it's talking about Negroes, clearly. The hair is black, crispy and woolly in texture. It is flat and elliptical, with no central canal or duct, like the hair of Europeans. Now, I would suggest it shouldn't even really be called hair. Apparently they used to make clothes out of it, according to Strabo in 30 BC. The nose is thick, broad and flat, often with turned up nostrils, exposing the red inner lining of the mucous membrane, similar to an ape. The arms and legs of the Negro are relatively longer than the European. The humerus is a trifle shorter, and the forearm longer, thereby approximating the simian form. And it looks to me as if the actual chest area is shorter, and the legs are longer, which gives them this monkey type look to them. And where they've got a shorter chest, they've also got a smaller lung cavity, which means they can't get so much air in there, which means they can't float. They're not very good at swimming. And because their bones are also a lot heavier than ours, combine that with the small lung capacity, And this is why Negroes sink and drown, and you won't ever find any on any swimming teams. The eyes are prominent, the iris black, and the orbits large. The eye often has a yellowish sclerotic coat over it, like that of a gorilla. The Negro has a shorter trunk. The cross-section of the chest is more circular than whites, and the pelvis is narrower and longer, as it is in an ape. The mouth is wide with very thick, large and protruding lips. Negro skin has a thick, superficial, horny layer which resists scratching and impedes the penetration of germs. And you see, this is why I suggest that they were never intended to ever wear clothes. They have a hide. We don't have a layer to protect us from scratching and germs, and of course this is why we wear clothes. The Negro has a larger and shorter neck, akin to that of the anthropoids. The cranial sutures are more simple than in the white type, and they close together earlier. The ears are roundish, rather small, standing somewhat high and detached, again thus approaching the simian form. And I would also add to that they are very rarely symmetrical. If you look at a Negro's ears, they don't reflect one another. One will be a little bit higher than the other, or one will be a different size to the other. Always very odd looking. The Negro is more powerfully developed from the pelvis down, while the white man is more powerfully developed in the chest. The jaw is larger and stronger and protrudes outwards, which, along with the lower retreating forehead, gives a facial angle of 68 to 70 degrees, as opposed to a facial angle of 80 to 82 degrees for Europeans. The hands and fingers are proportionally narrower and longer. The wrist and ankles are shorter and more robust. The frontal and parietal bones of the cranium are less excavated and less capacious. The skull is thicker, especially on the sides. The brain of the Negro on average is 9 to 20% smaller than whites. The teeth are larger and are wider apart than in the white race. The three curvatures of the spine are less pronounced in the Negro than in the white, and thus more characteristic of an ape. The femur of the Negro is less oblique. The tibia or shin bone is more curved and bent forwards, and the calf of the leg is high and but little developed. The heel is broad and projecting, the foot long and broad, but slightly arched, causing flat soles, and the great toe is shorter than in the white. The two bones proper of the nose are occasionally united, as they are in apes. Fact number 30. Blood group studies made during World War II suggest that the American Negro gene pool is actually about 28% white. And this is despite all manner of institutional discrimination, social segregation, etc., etc. Keep in mind that the results of tests from true black Africans would show even bigger differences than we see here from whites. Next up, crime. Fact 31. The rate at which blacks commit murder is 13 times that of whites. Rape and assault 10 times. These figures, as given by the FBI reports, vary somewhat from year to year, but they fairly represent the trend for the past decade. Fact 32. According to the Justice Department, 1 in every 4 black males between the ages of 20 and 29 is currently in prison or on probation or parole. And of course that gets put forward as racism. Instead of thinking, well, blacks are obviously more prone to committing crimes, our foolish white brethren have believed this lie that the reason why blacks are in prison is because we've been racist to them. How can we say that we've been racist to them? when we've had a black president? How can they say we've been racist to them when we have affirmative action? We have reverse discrimination. We have quotas for the numbers of blacks that should be on the police force, and quotas for the number of blacks that should be on television. And in fact, all these institutions now, we have quotas saying that we should be putting blacks on there regardless of merit, regardless of any achievements that they've actually made. And I bet that makes no difference whatsoever to the amount of blacks in prison. In fact, what they're actually saying now in Britain is that if you have a black criminal and he's in the dock, then it has to be assumed that the black criminal has been the victim of racism, has been the victim of not having as good an upbringing as he would have had as if he was white, and any sentence has to reflect that and has to be reduced because of that fact. So blacks now in Britain will receive lesser criminal sentencing than whites purely because of the colour of their skin, and purely because that's the only way that they can actually get down the numbers of blacks that we have in our prisons. Because they're so prone to commit crime, the only way to cut down on the ratio of black to white in prison is to just not lock the Negroes up for these crimes. Fact 33. Though only 12% of the US population, blacks commit more than half of all rapes and robberies, 60% of all murders in the US. Fact number 34. Approximately 50% of all black males will be arrested and charged with a serious felony during their lifetime. Fact 35. A black person is 56 times more likely to attack a white person than vice versa. Fact 36. Black rapists choose white victims over half the time, 30 times as often as whites choose blacks. Now, I would suggest that whites would never choose a Negro woman to rape. One white woman gets raped by a Negro every 15 minutes in America. And if you look at the figures, there just aren't any cases of negresses being raped by white men. Fact 37. The annual report from the Department of Justice shows that when whites commit violence, they do it to blacks 2.4% of the time. Blacks, on the other hand, choose white victims more than half the time. Fact 38. In New York City, any white is over 300 times more likely to be assaulted by a gang of blacks than is a black by a gang of whites. And don't forget that Negroes only make up 12 to 15% of the population, and yet they are 300 times more likely to be attacking whites if they're in a gang. Fact 39. Many people argue that high black incarceration rates show that police centre enforcement at black crimes and ignore white-collar crimes. However, blacks commit a disproportionate number of white-collar offences as well. In 1990, blacks were nearly 3 times as likely to be arrested for forgery, counterfeiting and embezzlement as whites. Well, we only have to look at third world governments to see how corrupt non-whites are, and particularly blacks in Africa. Of course they're going to be corrupt. Fact 40. Many people believe that crime is a product of poverty and lack of advantages. However, the District of Columbia, which enjoys the highest average annual salaries and is second only to Alaska in personal income per capita, leads the nation in just about every category of crime, including murder, robbery, aggravated assault and vehicle theft. DC also has the country's strictest gun control, highest police costs per capita, highest ratio of police and correctional officers per citizen, and the highest rate of incarceration. Its permanent population is over 80% black. West Virginia, which has the nation's lowest crime rate, suffers from chronic poverty and has the highest unemployment in the United States. It also has the fewest police per capita. West Virginia is over 96% white. Next, we'll move on to the black family. Fact 41.
46% of inner-city black men between the ages of 16 and 62 are unemployed. We have rather similar figures for Muslims in Britain, I think. Fact 42. More than 66% of the children of Negroes are born out of wedlock. Per capita, their illegitimacy rate is 10 times that of whites. Now, this must have been written some time ago, because I believe it's up to about 86% now. 86% of Negroes are born out of wedlock. And of course, the only reason why they did get married is because they were encouraged to when they were slaves. They wanted to imitate the white people, because there was no tradition of marriage in Africa. No tradition of it at all. They would have as many wives as they wanted. They'd sleep with whoever they liked. They'd offer their wives to people. And it was common for these white explorers, when they went exploring there, for the Negroes to offer them their wives. They didn't take vows. There was you cannot compare a Negro raping a Negress, as many Negresses as he feels like, or owning them, to one white man having one white wife and taking vows. When they were slaves, the slave masters would encourage them to copy them, and the slave masters set a good example. But once the Negroes were freed, there was no need for them to continue to get married. And so we have the phenomena of the baby mama. That's what comes natural to Negroes, is for a Negro, or buck Negro, to have as many hoes as he can, and showing them off is the same as him showing off his wealth. That's why he likes to wear all his gold jewellery and cover himself in rocks and bits of metal, out of insecurity, I guess, really. But it's the same with the hoes, with the women. He just sees them as wealth. They look at their women in a completely different way to the way that the white man looks at our white women. Fact 43. Blacks are 4.5 times more likely than whites to be on welfare. Well, again, this is because a white man doesn't want to be on welfare. If a white man is on welfare, he will feel useless. Whites have to feel as if we are contributing to society in some way or other. We have to be productive. We have to be creative. Whereas so long as a Negro's got food and warmth, why would he want to work? Why would he want to do anything if he can be given what he needs? Whereas the white man is always striving for more. I mean, we see this in Africa, where the whole of Africa is on welfare, effectively. Food Aid goes there, they feed these Negroes because they're starving, or so they say, and yet they continue to breed. They continue to breed more and more of them. And the next time that the Food Aid go back there, there's 2 or 3 times as many, all holding out their hands, all expecting to be fed. None of them capable of finding their own water even, let alone their own food. And yet they will continue to breed because they're quite happy just to be given everything. They don't actually want any more than that, and that's fair enough. But that's because they're Negroes. They're completely different to whites. Fact 44: more than 35% of all black men in US cities are drug or alcohol abusers, and they're also mainly the drug sellers. Next, we'll move on to beauty. Fact 45. The January 1986 issue of the Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies, Skin Colour Preference, Sexual Dimorphism and Sexual Selection, a Case of Gene Culture Co-Evolution, by Peter Frost and Pierre van der Herg, stated that in any given race, the women tend to have lighter complexions than the men. Using standard ethnographic files from 51 societies on 5 continents, which have recorded their preference for human skin colour, the study found that 30 preferred lighter women, and 14 preferred lighter women and lighter men. The cultures of India, China, Brazil and Bali, as well as the Arabs and Negroes, regard the lightest skinned women as the most beautiful, perpetuating the aesthetic appeal of the ivory-skinned, rosy-cheeked, blue-eyed, blonde, Nordic ideal of feminine beauty, even though they themselves do not possess the genetic capacity to reproduce such an organism. Over time, the study said, the upper classes of all races have become lighter skinned than their fellow countrymen, because they have repeatedly skimmed off the fairer women from the lower classes. Fact 46. Scientific research on what constitutes human beauty, in which 300 judges of various backgrounds were shown portrait photographs and asked to rate the beauty of the individual's face, has revealed that Nordic whites are universally recognised as the most attractive humans, even by blacks. The judges were instructed to evaluate the faces solely on his or her personal standards of beauty and not to consider popular norms. And the study itself actually goes from people aged 7 years old to 12 years old to adults, and every single one of them gave whites the highest rating, either white males or white females, regardless of who or what they were doing the judging. Fact 47. In experiments in which black children have been left to themselves with white and black dolls, it has been found that most of them would rather play with white dolls. This is true all over the world, even in such places as Tobago. Next, American history. Fact 48. The Declaration of Independence, which contains the oft-repeated phrase, "all men are created equal," was written by Thomas Jefferson, who owned about 200 slaves at the time, and never set any of them free, including the mulattoes and quadroons. Jefferson's words certainly had no reference to Negroes, who at that time had no place in American society except as property. And I'll just interject here and say that the Declaration of Independence, where it says, "all men are created equal," the only way you could ever say all men are created equal is if you were talking about white men and you were in the company of white and blacks. And what happened was, before white people went to America, before there was the black slaves there, we had Europe, we had European nations. No one nation was equal to another. You can't say one European nation is the same as another European nation, and you can't say one man is equal to another man. You can't say that a doctor is equal to a farmer, or an unemployed person is equal to a politician, or maybe you could in some circumstances. But there's no way that if you've just got white people around you that you could say all men are created equal. But as soon as you add Negroes into the equation, then you have two distinct types. You have black and you have white. And then you can say that all white men are equal, because all white men are equal when in the presence of Negroes, because the whites together form one group. And there's a book, White Supremacism and Negro Subordination, I believe it is called. And this was written around the time of the Declaration of Independence. And he makes it really clear that the only reason why this came about, this idea that all men are created equal, is because this was for the first time white men were juxtaposed with Negroes. And for the first time ever, white men realised that they were all equal together as white men, but certainly not with Negroes. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence and think that it's actually talking about Negroes and whites, then it's obviously a lie, because whites are not equal to blacks. White is not the same as black. There's a fundamental difference between what is white and what is black. As much of a fundamental difference as between what is the number 1 and what is the number 0. You can't say that all numbers are created equal. They certainly aren't. All numbers containing the number 1 and no other number are created equal. But you cannot say that all numbers are created equal. You cannot say that all men are created equal. Men can only be equal to one another when they are faced with an unequal race, when they are juxtaposed against a subordinate race. That's the only time when you can say that all white men are equal to one another, or of equal value. Fact 49. The Constitution was written by and for we the people, and dedicated to ourselves and our posterity. All of the 55 delegates that met in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, and all of the members of the 13 state conventions that ratified it, were of the white race. Webster's Dictionary of 1828 defines posterity as posterity, 1. Descendants, children, children's children, etc., indefinitely, the race that proceeds from a progenitor. 2. In a general sense, succeeding generations, opposed to ancestors. So the Constitution, again, it cannot be clearer that the Constitution only applies to white people, does not apply to anybody else, can only ever apply to white people. The posterity of the people that wrote it, none of them could be Negroes, because none of them were Negroes that wrote it. Fact 50. The 14th Amendment is invalid for the following reasons. It was never ratified by 3/4 of all the states in the Union, according to Article 5 of the USS Constitution. Out of 37 states, 16 had rejected it. Many of the states who were counted as ratifying it were compelled to do so under duress of military occupation. Any legal act entered into under force, duress, or coercion is automatically null and void. The fact that 23 senators have been unlawfully excluded from the US Senate shows that the joint resolution proposing the amendment was not submitted to or adopted by a constitutional Congress. The intent of the 14th Amendment is repugnant to the original US Constitution and the organic law of the land. It did not and could not repeal anything that was a part of the organic law. Therefore, the principles of precedent and stare decisis render it void. Fact 51. In Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of September 1862, he said, "I have urged the colonization of the Negroes back to Africa, and I shall continue. My Emancipation Proclamation was linked with this plan of colonization. There is no room for two distinct races of white men in America, much less for two distinct races of whites and blacks. I can think of no greater calamity than the assimilation of the Negro into our social and political life as our equal. Within 20 years we can peacefully colonize the Negro under conditions in which he can rise to the full measure of manhood. This he can never do here. We can never attain the ideal union our fathers dreamed, with millions of an alien, inferior race among us, whose assimilation is neither possible nor desirable." Now, this part where he was saying about manhood and the Negro race rising to manhood, this is because they saw the Negroes as children. They certainly didn't hate them, they didn't want to exterminate them, they saw them as children. The white slave masters often grew very attached to their Negroes, and the Negroes looked up to the slave master as if he was their father. Part of this was the actual physique of the Negro. The Negro is incapable of growing a beard. If you see Negroes with beards today, that's because they've got white blood. They've mixed in with white blood. The Negro couldn't grow a beard. So because the white man can grow a beard, they looked at the black race as being a child race. They couldn't mature. And in a way they were quite right, because the Negro does stop maturing early. His IQ gets to a certain level, and then he never progresses from there. This is why Negroes are very materialistic, and they continue to behave like they're teenagers for the rest of their lives, because they don't mature. They're not an adult race like the white race is. So this idea of Abraham Lincoln's, that if they were left on their own, then they could rise to the full measure of manhood, it's never happened in the entirety of the history of the world, and it never will happen. Fact 52. Lincoln actually proposed an amendment to the Constitution that would have authorized Congress to recolonize all freed blacks back to Africa. On August 15th, 1862, Congress did appropriate over $500,000 for that purpose. Thousands of Negroes had been shipped back when Lincoln was shot. And all we have to do really is look at Liberia today to see that trying to civilize the Negro will always be a failed experiment. Liberia was the land that was bought for these freed blacks to go back to. They were given the American Constitution. They were given all the help they needed in order to build a functioning society with a democracy, investment, everything. And look at what Liberia is like today. Cannibal warlords, people eating one another. Negroes will always regress back to the mean, and the Negro average is cannibalism. That cannibalism and slavery. That's how they've lived for thousands of years. And that's what our countries are going to turn into once we reach peak Negro. Fact 53. The District of Columbia, which is approximately 70% black, leads the US in many areas. It has the nation's highest crime rates, the strictest gun control, the highest incarceration rates, the highest birth rate, and the highest death rate, the highest rate of federal assistance per capita, the highest number of welfare recipients per capita, the highest rate of illegitimacy, the highest high school dropout rate, even though its teachers are the highest paid in the United States, the highest rate of gonorrhea and syphilis. And to crown it all off, it also has the highest incidence of AIDS. Something in common there with the whole of Africa, which has the highest amount of AIDS out of any countries in the world, and happens to be about 99% black over there. Portugal. Let's have some facts about Portugal. Fact 54. Populated by white stock, the nation of Portugal rose in 4 centuries to be the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. A great commercial and maritime power, it had large colonies in Asia, Africa, and America. Its seamen were the first to explore Western Africa, and they brought back hundreds of Negro slaves. Not captured by them, I'll add, but actually sold to them by other Negroes. By 1550, at the height of Portugal's power, 1/10 of its population were blacks. Today, Portugal's population is described as one of the most homogeneous in Europe, having slowly absorbed the Negro gene pool. As of 1975, it had lost all of its outside territories. Its workers are the lowest paid in Europe, and they have the highest rate of illiteracy and a high infant mortality rate. In terms of art, literature, music, science, and philosophy, the new Portugal has produced virtually nothing in 100 years, and by most standards is the most backwards nation in Europe. Keep in mind that the black population of the United States is currently approximately 13%. And all it took was 1/10 of the population in Portugal to be black for it to turn out how it has today. There's another part to the story of Portugal, actually. All their intelligentsia, all the alpha males, left for the New World because they had so many colonies around the world. All the best people left to go to these new colonies. So what the actual stock that they had of white people left in Portugal wasn't the very best. And of course, once you start adding Negroes to it, then that's going to destroy it completely, and it's going to have no chance of bouncing back. Let's have a look at Haiti. Fact 55. The Republic of Haiti, the only completely black republic in the Western Hemisphere, also happens to be the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It also has the lowest life expectancy, the highest illiteracy, the lowest per capita consumption of newsprint, and the lowest per capita gross national product. and the lowest level of political stability. Fact 56. Haiti once had a promising future. Before 1789, as a French colony under white rule, Saint Domingo, in Haiti, was as rich or richer in productivity as all the 13 American colonies combined. It was considered the crown jewel of the French colonial system, and it was in fact the most prosperous colony anywhere in the world. Populated by 40,000 whites, 27,000 freed mulattoes, and 450,000 black slaves, and with a bountiful climate and productive soil, it supplied all of France and half of Europe with sugar, coffee, and cotton. But in 1791, the French government issued a decree ordering Haiti to give the vote to the mulattoes, and soon after, another decree ordering freedom for all the slaves. This resulted in a bloody civil war in which the entire white population, about 40,000 Frenchmen, was murdered down to the last man, woman, and child. Rape, decapitation, and mutilation were committed almost universally upon their bodies. Fact 57. After the blacks massacred the last of the white population in 1804, Haiti remained a part of Saint Domingo until 1844, when it became a separate republic. Between 1844 and 1915, only one Haitian president completed his term in office. 14 were ousted by armed uprisings. One was blown up, one was poisoned, and another was hacked to pieces by a mob. Between 1908 and 1915, the revolutions and assassinations increased so rapidly that a United States military occupation was needed to restore order. This lasted from 1915 to 1934, and thereafter followed 12 years of rule by a mulatto elite, which ended in the resumption of control by the black military in 1946. Since then, wholesale corruption and political murder have been the rule. And since then, I've lost count of the amount of times that they've had environmental tragedies over there and calling for charity and people to go over there and send money over there. The country's been bailed out loads of times. And when you think that it was so wealthy and it was providing all the cotton and the sugar and everything that was needed for France and most of Europe when it was under white rule, and once it's under blacks, it's not capable of producing anything. It's the same as North Africa. North Africa, when it was under the white Romans, provided all the food needed for the Roman Empire. South Africa used to be a first world country. That used to export food to the rest of the world. But as soon as it's in the hands of blacks, then they'll just ruin the country and expect the rest of the world to pay for it. And when it's talking about these slaves, when it's saying that there was, what was the number, 40,000 slaves, I believe it said, 40,000 whites and 450,000 black slaves. People look at slavery and think, oh, this is terrible, the poor black man. But the black man was employed. It's not as if he was starved to death to work. You can't get somebody to work if they're starving to death. These Negroes were clothed, they were housed, they were fed, they were watered, they were medicated, they were looked after. The only difference between slavery back then and working today is that we get paid our wages and we have a choice of what we want to spend our wages on. Back then, there were very few shops. If you'd actually given these Negro wages, what would they have spent it on? What would they have bought? They didn't need to buy anything. They had everything paid for. And if you look at the way that we live today, so much of our money goes on paying rent or for a mortgage, for the electric, for the gas, for the water, for the travel, for your clothes. All of these things were paid for back then by the white slave masters. So slavery wasn't a bad institution. It was a good institution for Negroes, and that's why Africa had slavery as its economy for thousands of years. This is why these Negroes would sell other Negroes, why they would sell them to white people, because that's the way their economy has always worked. They know that they need looking after. They're not capable of looking after themselves, so they would sell each other, knowing that it would be bought. If you were bought by a white man, you'd be looked after well. If they were bought by an Arab, the chances are they would be castrated. And the white people looked on these slaves most of the time as if they were children. We looked on them as if they were a childlike race that just needed maturing and just needed a good example shown to them by the slave masters. And white people were the ones that got rid of slavery. It's just unbelievable the way these ungrateful blacks start demanding reparations today from white people, when if it wasn't for white people, they would still be slaves. In actual fact, they would be better off, I believe. I believe they would be better off. It's white people that weren't better off, because white people had problems getting jobs and had problems getting work, because these rich slave masters could buy a slave and then they owned the slave for life, whereas white people wanted wages. Back to 100 facts about race, and now we'll move to India. Fact 58. India's Negroid peoples have been subjected to numerous white invasions for over 5,000 years, prompting the rise and fall of one civilization after another, as the white invaders became absorbed into the non-white masses. Then, around 1800 BC, Aryans again invaded from the northwest, this time establishing a rigid caste system, or Varna system, which means colour, which was a system of white supremacy, which eventually evolved into an integral part of the Hindu religion. Interracial mixing was banned and punishable by death. In actual fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says that all evil comes from race mixing. There's no good that can come from that. The adulteration of the blood leads to the confusion of memory, the confusion of race memory, and all evil in the world. Fact 59. Led by an Aryan ruling class, classical India blossomed into a great culture, giving expression to philosophy, poetry, science, mathematics, and literature. The land prospered as never before or after. And we can still see traces of the universities that they had. They're massive universities over there. You can look them up on Wikipedia. It's far, far different to how it is today, where they're not even capable of fixing up their own sewage systems. They still shit in the street, as it were. Which is forewarned about in the ancient Hindu texts. It says in the last days, these mongrels will be living after the manner of the birds and the beasts, which basically means shitting outside. Fact 60. The caste system lasted around 2,000 years, probably longer than any civilization under similar racial circumstances. However, eventually the castes broke down due to miscegenation, and by modern times virtually no pure whites were remaining. And we have discussed this, myself and Subal, on SS Britannia a few times, about what actually caused these castes to break down. Islam was a large cause of it. As we know, race doesn't exist in Islam. You can breed with your slaves, and it doesn't matter if you're a mongrel. But before that, Buddhism took over, and Buddhism is very nihilistic, very nihilistic, and Buddhism sort of prepared the way for these Muslims to then come in and destroy the caste system. But if you want to learn more about it, then check out the SS Britannia episodes that I've done with Subal, where we were discussing this. I believe that was fairly early on in the series. Fact 61. Today, India has 834 million people who speak 150 different languages and dialects. When the annual rainfall is insufficient, they die of starvation at a rate of 2 million to 6 million per year. India has the highest birth rate in Asia and one of the lowest per capita incomes in the world, and an illiteracy rate close to 70%. Shocking figures, though, is when you think about the intelligent Indian doctors that you see and the intelligent Indian computer programmers that you see. But when you realise just how many people there are that actually live in India, and you realise that these alpha Indians make up 0.00001% of the actual Indians. So I believe we get a false image of what India is like from the Indian expats that we see. And the other Indian expats that we see are Pakis, and they're Muslims. There's a big difference between Muslims and Hindus, a huge difference between them. Of course, none of them should be in white countries. They should be in their own countries, in their own territory, because otherwise our countries are going to turn out looking just like India and Brazil and these other formerly white countries that all turned brown. Let's have a look at Egypt. Fact 62. Ancient Egypt was founded and built by Mediterranean Caucasians as far back as 4500 BC. Egypt's period of greatness was from 3400 BC to 1800 BC and was characterized by its amazing architecture, pyramids, temples, and mastery of mathematics and engineering, the remnants of which are still evident today. The white Egyptians pioneered medicine, chemistry, astronomy, and law. In many cases, their achievements remain unequalled. We still couldn't build a structure like the Great Pyramid to this day. The sheeting that was on the outside of that was so thin, and it was glued to the casing stones in such a way that we just couldn't do that today. Imagine how that would have looked thousands of years ago, reflecting the sun with this plating that they had on the outside of it. It must have looked quite an amazing sight. And the actual measurements involved in that pyramid, just by chance, there's no way that it would actually happen. And it encoded in the pyramid itself is the circumference of the Earth, the distance to the Moon, ratio from the Moon to the Sun, all these sorts of things that are actually encoded into it. There's also a lot of biblical measurements that tie up with biblical dates as well. And it does say in the Bible that there will be an altar to the Lord on the border of Egypt. And when you look at the actual wording of this verse, that's what it's talking about. It's talking about the Great Pyramid. And I believe the Great Pyramid wasn't actually built by the Egyptians that were living there. It was built by other Egyptians that came in, because Egypt was a multi-white cultural empire. You had lots of different white nations, different white ethnicities that were there at first, and then eventually it fell to the brown peoples. But at first it was different white tribes. Fact 63. Around 3400 BC, Egypt's civilization began to spread up the Nile River, bringing it in close contact with the black Nubians to the south. Soon, they were using blacks for slave labour, and Egypt became history's first melting pot. Well, I would suggest maybe Babylon was actually history's first melting pot. I guess it goes on what documents you're looking at. Fact 64. In time, the infusion of Negro blood worked itself up from the bottom of Egyptian society. The slaves were eventually freed, received political equality, and took posts of authority in government. Now, that's equal rights, humanism, liberalism, saying that these people are the same as us, we should be giving them the same rights that we've got. And as soon as you do that, as soon as they have equality, they just interbreed with the good stock, the alpha stock, the white people that kept their racial purity. They end up interbreeding with them, and the country is destroyed. I mean, just look at Egypt today. Just look at what's living there today. They have difficulty building their own houses, let alone a pyramid. And if you look at advanced Arab cities or advanced Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Dubai, and you see those great skyscrapers that they have and these great buildings that have been built over there, they've all been designed by white people. They may have got black slaves to do the legwork, but they're all being designed by white architects, and it's all white people that are in charge of the building projects. Fact 65. By the time of King Tut, 1370 to 1352 BC, even the ruling classes had been mongrelized, and Egypt began a tailspin downwards. Today, the once mighty Egypt is very much a third world country, having lost its art, its medicine, its architectural ability, and its position in world affairs. The absurd notion that ancient Egypt was a product of Negro ingenuity is now being widely disseminated in the schools. Although scholars know this is a blatant lie, they justify the deception by assuming that it will boost the self-esteem of black children. As if black children needed their self-esteem boosting. And we know that Negroes already have a highly inflated opinion of themselves that doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. And this has been proved countless times with experiments where they ask the Negro how well they think they just did in an exam, and the Negro will tell them that they got 100 out of 100, and then they'll actually look at the results, and the Negro would have got 20 out of 100, and various other experiments like that. Negroes always have a higher opinion of themselves than they actually do, yet for some reason they thought if we make up a history for these Negroes, since they didn't have one, that will encourage them to learn more. Maybe then they'll boost their intelligence. But as we can see, it hasn't boosted their intelligence at all. It's just made them hate white people all the more and invent up fantasies about white people living in caves while Negroes were flying around in spaceships building pyramids. And the proof for Egypt being white, I mean, you can look at the mummies, you can look at these Caucasian mummies that they have, you can look at the body structure of the people that are drawn in the pictures, you can look at the body structure of the gods. I mean, someone who really doesn't know much about race will look at them and say, well, yes, well, look, they've got brown skin. All those images are of people with brown skin. But that's because they were sunburnt. And it's not about race, isn't about skin colour. It isn't about skin colour. Skin colour is a small part of it. Just one of a myriad of differences between the races. If you look at the proportions of the people that are depicted in the Egyptian pictures, then you'll see that they're white, they're Caucasian, they've got Caucasian skulls, they've got Caucasian body proportion between their arms and their legs and their chests. You can see from the shape of the people that they're white. So don't get taken in by looking at somebody with brown skin. Look at the proportions, and then you'll be able to tell what race they are. And when Egypt started to turn brown, we can see that in the mosaics. We can see that the mosaics that they had at the time, and when Egypt was under Roman rule and under Alexander the Great, the mosaics that they built or created, you can see the pictures of them. They got mulatto eyes and curly mulatto hair. So you can see that the damage was already done even by that time. Let's have a look at South Africa. Now, when we look at these facts about South Africa, we must remember that this was written some decades back, so things will have changed drastically in the last 20 years since South Africa fell from under the people that created the country and built the country and has been taken over by their former employees. Fact 66. White people have lived in South Africa much longer than Negroes. There have been white settlements in South Africa for over 300 years, about the same length of time that Europeans have lived in North America. Even 150 years after the first colonies around Cape Town, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were still no blacks within 500 miles. The blacks wandered in from Central Africa later on, possibly fleeing the slave trade or due to famine. In fact, most of South Africa's blacks were born in other countries. I believe when they first got there was pygmies, or there was a few little tribes, but there wasn't the actual Congoid, the actual Negro, the Negroid, black-faced type that we are used to thinking of when we think of Negroes. They weren't actually there, but I do think they had Bushmen there. But the Bushmen themselves and the pygmies were wiped out by these other Negroes eating them, hunting them down and eating them. There was definitely no Negro civilization there, and it never has been a Negro civilization anywhere. Fact 67. South Africa is by far the wealthiest and most advanced country in Africa, producing nearly 75% of the continent's gross national product. It is almost completely self-sufficient, so boycotts have little effect upon its economy. In fact, most of Africa is dependent upon South Africa. South Africa is governed by a Western parliamentary republic and strictly segregated racially. South Africa grants complete self-government to the blacks in their own areas of the country. And this is written back when South Africa was a first world country, when it was still under the white people. So this must be 30 years old, this document. Things have just got worse since then, obviously. And it doesn't take away from the fact that these are all facts, and you can check out the references yourselves if you want to find the article for yourselves. Fact 68. Though South Africa is perpetually criticised by the world's press for its racial separatism, its blacks live better than the blacks of any other African country and are multiplying rapidly and healthily. 87% of black welfare costs are being paid for by the white man. This includes food, clothing, training, housing, education and healthcare, even old age pensions. Don't forget, these Negroes, they had their own areas, and the greatest thing about the white people, the greatest gift that white people gave to the Negroes was police. They policed the townships. They stopped the Negroes from killing one another. And as soon as the whites were out of Africa, you see these huge wars going on in the Congo, and the Hutsis and the Tutsis, and they just massacre one another and maim one another and butcher one another and eat one another. And once you have the whites there policing them, all of that stopped. All of that stopped. And the Negroes were so grateful for that. And if you look at South Africa now, they're back to doing the same again. South Africa is the crime centre of the entire world. Fact 69. Thousands of South African blacks graduate from college every year, more than 3 times as many as in the rest of Africa combined. Every black child is within walking distance of a primary school. Africa's largest hospital, which serves blacks almost exclusively and performs over 1,800 operations per month, is in South Africa. And look at what the Negroes did with those schools that they had built for them. They burned them down. And in South Africa's hospital now, you have to bring your own hypodermic needles, your own bedclothes, your own food, your own medicine. You have to provide everything for yourself, because the Negroes will just steal it if it's provided by the state. Fact 70. The blacks of South Africa own more cars than do all the citizens of the Soviet Union. So these Negroes are really making good use of the white man's technology and the white man's civilization. We had no need to give it to them. They weren't living in that part of the country. We went there and we developed the country. We developed the land. We built infrastructure, hospitals, schools, telecommunications, railways, transport, trade. We basically civilized that part of the continent. And instead of being thanked for that, and instead of the blacks saying, thank you very much for letting us in to your city and treating us so well, they demanded that they take over everything. And now it's all ruined. Now it's all destroyed, and the white people are refugees, and the white people need to come back to Europe, and our traitors in Europe won't let them come in. They won't designate them as refugees. Never mind the fact that thousands of them, these white farmers, have been butchered by these Negroes that they were so kind to years ago. Fact 71. South Africa has more black doctors, black lawyers, black professional people and black millionaires than all of the rest of the world combined. They really didn't treat these Negroes badly, you know. They really did treat them well. And this just shows that segregation works, apartheid works, because they had more black doctors, lawyers, professionals and millionaires than all the rest of the world combined. That means in America, that means all these countries where we don't have apartheid, all the Negroes were far worse off than they were in apartheid South Africa. Fact 72. In fact, conditions are, quote, so bad, unquote, for blacks in South Africa that the country has a tremendous problem with illegal black immigration, having over 1 million illegal foreign workers. Just like Europe today, the Negroes were dying to break in to the country and have some of it. That's how badly these Negroes were treated. A million of them wanted to break in there so that they could work for the slave master white man. Truth is far, far stranger than fiction. To the blinkered leftists who refuse to even look at the evidence and believe that they know it all already. And today we're going to start with fact 73, and that's looking at Iceland. Iceland, the only all-white nation in the world. And remember, this was written 30 years ago. Iceland, the only all-white nation in the world, has the world's highest literacy rate, 100%. It is an island of cooled volcanic magma located just south of the Arctic Circle. It has no coal, no fuel, no timber, no mineral wealth or natural resources, and no navigable rivers. 75% of the interior is uninhabitable, and only about 1% of the land is arable. It is the youngest nation in Europe and one of the most isolated countries in the world. Nonetheless, Iceland is number 2 in the world in life expectancy and has one of the world's highest standards of living in terms of per capita income. It has tremendous medical facilities and a thriving publishing business. Virtually every family has a telephone. Upon graduation from high school, each Icelandic student has learned 5 languages. Now, this is really showing how dated this actually is, because Iceland now, they never used to even have murders there. They never really had a crime rate at all. But now, I'm reliably informed, there's Negroes there, there is Muslims there, there are murders that actually happen there. And another thing that you can tell from this, if you think about this idea that whites evolved in the north, we can't have evolved in the north because we needed to be extremely technologically proficient in order to survive in the north. And if you think about Iceland, it's got no timber, no mineral wealth, no natural resources, and yet white people can survive there because we have the technological know-how. We've actually been in Iceland for well over 1,000 years. Iceland crops up in the old British historical documents and references to Iceland. And the people themselves have kept records. They've still got all their family trees so they can do all the genetic testing. A very, very advanced country, Iceland. But unfortunately, it's getting ruined now because Negroes and Muslims and all the rest of the world's dross is flooding in there and demanding refugee status and human rights and all the other things that, unfortunate things that we've coming across in the 21st century. Let's have a look at Martin Luther King, shall we? Fact 75. On January the 31st, 1977, Martin Luther King's FBI records were sealed by court order until the year 2027 because, as his wife said, its release would destroy his reputation. These records are rumoured to contain instances of bizarre sexual perversion and homosexuality, and proof that King was under the direct orders of Soviet spies and financed by the Communist Party. Well, I think that's been proved beyond a shadow of doubt, that he was working for the Communist Party and that he was into bizarre sexual perversions. I believe he died with 2 prostitutes. He liked to screw white prostitutes, basically. Fact 78. The Wall Street Journal, November the 9th, 1990, disclosed that Stanford University editors of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. have long known that King was guilty of plagiarism in his 1955 Boston University doctoral thesis, having lifted significant portions from the works of other writers and graduate students. And Michael Hoffman has done some very good work exposing Martin Luther King. There's a very good video on YouTube Might be called something to do with the beast or something like that, but I do recommend people watch that to find out more about Martin Luther King. Fact 79. Martin Luther King frequently enjoyed prostitutes and paid for them with his church's money. Still, Congress has voted to make King's birthday a national holiday, in most places replacing Columbus Day or Washington's birthday as an official observance. And we can see from this the way that this is increasing. I mean, back then they were changing Columbus Day and Washington's birthday for Martin Luther King Day, and today, in 2017, they're literally pulling down the statues of the Civil War heroes, white Civil War heroes, literally pulling down the statues of them and trying to replace us. This has been going on for a long time, and it just keeps increasing, and it will keep increasing until we put a stop to it. Fact 80. Almost every state in the Union has a Martin Luther King holiday, and almost every city has a King Boulevard or a King Civic Centre. Yet the electoral evidence suggests that Americans will almost always vote down honours for King when given a chance. I bet. Fact 81, and now we're on to some miscellaneous facts. Fact 81. The entire continent of Africa, perhaps the Earth's richest land, accounts for only 3% of world trade. So how can people say that blacks don't have any money and don't have any wealth and are all paupers in Africa because the white man keeps them down, when it's the richest continent in the world? Richest continent in the world. And they can't say that they don't know how to develop it, because we taught them how to develop it. We spent the last 200 years teaching Negroes how to develop their own land, building up their countries for them, building modern cities, modern infrastructure. And then we handed it all over to them. We said, here you go. You can follow our democratic system. You can vote, put your own leaders in power. They are running things in Africa. And yet they are still, the whole continent is in a state of poverty. And that is down to the Negro himself. The Negro has to be the only animal on earth that cannot find its own water for himself. We still have to provide water for the Negro. There are advertisements on television begging white people to pay for charities to go over to Africa and dig wells for Negroes where they're not capable of doing it for themselves. Not capable of feeding themselves, and yet they've got the richest continent on earth. Fact 82. Almost all blacks who have become leaders in fields other than athletics or music have had some white ancestry. Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Alex Haley, Thurgood Marshall, Bryant Gumbel, Colin Powell, Carl Rowan, Ed Bradley, Doug Wilder, and more. And according to Dr. E.B. Reuter, of successful and best-known men that the Negro race has produced, at least 13/14 are men of mixed blood. You would expect that. In the first episode of this series, we looked at the IQ levels, and mixing white blood in there with the Negro blood raises the IQ. Fact 85. Blacks are 50 times more likely to have syphilis than whites. That's because of their reckless sexual habits. They also have higher testosterone. They also start breeding at a younger age. They go through puberty at a younger age. They're much more sexually active. And the institution of marriage never existed on the continent of Africa. The idea of actually getting married was just copied by them from the slave owners, and once they were freed, there was no need for them to copy it anymore. They were told that the white guy was the bad man. The white man was the bad guy that had kept the Negro down. So why would the Negro want to copy the white man anymore? Which is why there's an 85% bastard rate among blacks now. Fact 86. Twice as many blacks as whites receive dishonourable discharge from the US military. Well, they've never had a law. So why would they be inclined to obey the law? They obviously have never had an inclination to come out with a system of law, never even had an inclination of the difference between right and wrong. So you would expect them to break the law, and you would expect them to receive dishonourable discharge from the US military. Just because something walks on two legs does not mean it's the same as the white man. Fact 87. A white woman is 15 times more likely to contract AIDS by engaging in sex with a Negro than with a white heterosexual. She's also 8 times more likely to be murdered by a black boyfriend than by a white boyfriend. A white woman is raped every 15 minutes in America by a Negro, and yet no negresses are ever raped by white men. Fact 88. 90% of US children with AIDS are black or Hispanic. Fact 89. In 1950, American schools were among the best in the world. However, vocal elements within our society demanded that the public schools take on a social engineering role as well as an educational one. Violent disruptions of American education were ordered by the Supreme Court for the purpose of breaking down racial barriers. For 30 years, American schools have diverted enormous resources into forced integration, quotas, and busing operations. Few people realise how expensive the busing is. The annual costs may run into tens of billions of dollars. In 1990, California alone was spending $500 million per year on integration. Many school districts spend a quarter or more of their budgets on transportation. In Milwaukee alone, and in a single school year, 30,000 staff hours were diverted into calculating the race of students to attend the various schools. And the results? Today's students rank at the very bottom worldwide in science and math. Some 40% of American adults are functionally illiterate, and standardized test scores have declined steadily for both whites and blacks. Today, the average white still scores 200 points higher on the combined SAT than the average black. Americans spend more on education than any other country in the world and have the worst results. Massive white flight to escape racial zoning has reduced the tax base of every major American city. In 1983, after nearly 2 generations of racial experimentation to promote equality, the research arm of the Department of Education could not produce a single study that showed black children were learning appreciably better after desegregation. And just think about this. Just think. Back then in the 60s, when they forced the white children to share schools with the Negroes, and the Negroes demanded that they had access to white children in their schools, and that once they had the white children in there, then they would get a better standard of education, and they would improve. And there was no improvement. And now, 40 years later, 30 or 40 years later, they're demanding that they have their own safe spaces. They have their own spaces with no whites in them. They're demanding on college and on campus that they just want to be taught by blacks in black schools. They want to get rid of all the pictures of white people, all the statues of white people, all references to white people. So they're wanting to be segregated again. Doesn't matter what you do for the Negro, he will never be pleased. He'll never be happy with what you're actually doing for him. All the while you say that Negroes are the same as us, they are going to be faced with the fact that they're not the same as us, and they never will be the same as us. And they're going to blame us for the fact that they don't have what we have. So we've gone full circle. We've gone from segregation, segregated schools that were just for Negroes, to mixing the two races together, destroying the intelligence and dragging the IQ down and dragging down the results of school children. And now they're saying that they want to go back to segregation. And it's okay for the blacks to say that. It's okay for the blacks to say, we don't want white people in our schools, we don't want white people in our university, we don't want to be taught by white people. But if we say we don't want to be around the black children, then we get accused of being racist. If we say we want white teachers for white children and all white schools, we get told that we're haters, and that's hate speech. It's complete double standards wherever you look. Fact 93. In black Africa, the average ruler lasts 7 months. What about Mugabe then? I think he's been in there for a little bit longer than 7 months. Fact 94. By 1995, a third of US students will be non-white, and whites will be a minority in the school districts of 5 states. Fact 95. Dr. William Shockley, the renowned geneticist at Stanford University and Nobel Prize winner for his work in the invention of the transistor, said, "The major cause for American Negroes' failure originates in hereditary and is thus not remedial to a major degree by improvement in the environment." Doesn't matter what environment you give them, doesn't matter how much money you give them, how much money you throw at them, you cannot increase their IQ, you cannot increase their intelligence. Just look at Liberia. They had a perfect country there, the richest continent in the world, Africa. They had America behind them. America developed the country, gave them the pattern of government, the same pattern of government, the same constitution as America, and yet it's a total failure, complete failure. You can take Negro children and crazy white people can adopt them, and the crazy white people that adopt Negroes are always well off, they're always middle class, and yet these Negro children that have been adopted always revert back to being the gangster Negro. They've done tests on this, and there is no improvement. It doesn't matter how much you change the Negro's environment. There will never be an improvement. Just look at the wealthy ones. Look at Bill Cosby. Still goes out drugging and raping white people. Look at these rappers that have a lot of money. They still get caught drugging and raping white people. Look at the black sports stars. Countless black sports stars have been accused of raping white people, getting involved in robberies. They just cannot help themselves. It's just a complete waste of resources in trying to turn them into something that they're not. Fact 96. In 1930, about 33% of the world was white. Today, the United Nations estimate that only 9.5% of the world's population is Caucasian, and this percentage is falling rapidly. White people are the minority. We are the minority in the world. At least 90% of the rest of the world is non-white. And diversity just means replacing the few remaining white people that are left with non-whites. And this is a process that has happened in every other country in the world throughout history. This is what happened to India. This is what happened to Egypt. This is what happened to Mesopotamia. All you have to do is look back in history at the originators of civilizations in those countries, and you discover that they were all originally white. And the same thing has been happening for thousands of years, and we're now in the end game. We're now in the end game. Less than 10% of the world's population is now white. The rest has all turned brown. And fact 97 is a bit of a joke fact. They've put this one in here to catch people out. And this is the lie that leftists are taught and that they believe is true. In fact 97 it says, "Every race has an equal capacity to learn and contribute to civilization, and any differences are caused by prejudice and racism. The fact that white skins are associated with civilization is merely a quirk of fortune and coincidence. Any attempt to distinguish the races is motivated by paranoia and hatred. We must prevent any investigation into the subject and work to melt society together into a raceless, nationless, harmonious utopia. And that just goes against all logic, doesn't it? It's like saying people don't actually work to achieve what they have. People don't actually get up in the morning and go and do a 40, 50-hour week to save their money to purchase the property that they live in, and they don't actually work to have what they have. Of course we work to have what we have, and our ancestors worked to build our civilization. If you look at what the Negro builds as a house, he just builds his mud hut, and you look at what the white man builds. The white man could spend decades, centuries, building cathedrals, where we'd literally spend 100 years working on one building. And none of these other races are capable of doing things like this. And we shouldn't expect them to be capable of it. The greatest sin is telling these other races that they are the same as us, that they're capable of doing these things. Because they're not. And they know that they're not. And when they see us saying that we are the same as them, they must make them so furiously angry to see us being so ungrateful for what we've been given, to see us not using what we've actually got. And I bet they must sit there thinking, if I had what he had, if I was white, I would damn well be proud of being white, and I would damn well work hard and make the best use of everything that I had. And we don't. We say we're exactly the same as the Negro. We're the same as him. We're no better than him. Or we can't keep our marriages together either. We can't keep ourselves off drugs. We can't prevent ourselves from catching AIDS. We can't stop ourselves from committing crime and forming gangs and stabbing one another up. We're just exactly the same as him. It's just a problem with progress. That's what it is. Nothing to do with race. Fact 98. In 1988, there were 9,406 cases of black-on-white rape, and fewer than 10 cases of white-on-black rape in the United States. And it's from those figures that you can work out that one white woman is raped every 15 minutes. And it's actually, well, by a Negro, and it's actually even worse than that in Europe. I believe there was an article when the 1,400 white girls got raped in Rotherham. There was an article on Countercurrents that worked out how many white girls were raped by Muslims in Europe, and it's actually worse than one white girl every 15 minutes in America. It's something like one white girl every 4 minutes, I believe. And that's a wide estimate as well. That's not trying to increase the number. Fact 99. For the book Intelligence and National Achievement by Raymond Cattell, 3 distinguished American scholars compare massive evidence of national IQ score averages worldwide and warn against the decline of any nation whose population reflects declining intelligence. Taking into consideration the differential birth rates of American ethnic stocks, they concluded that American ability is declining rapidly. And it's not just happening in America, it's happening all over Europe. If you look at the IQ scores over the last 40 or 50 years, they are all going down. And if you look at the exam results and the intelligence of people, it's all dwindling. The more you import other races into your country, the lower the intelligence and life achievements, the lower the life achievements are. I can just think back now, thinking back to people that were older than me that used to go to university. They were so intelligent, really, really clever people. And yet you look at people that go to university now. I never even went to secondary school. And I'm not bragging, but there are a lot of cases where I know more than people that have been to university today. Fact 100. The American taxpayers have spent over $2.5 trillion trying to upgrade blacks since the 1960s. Just think what that money could have gone on. $2.5 trillion trying to make a dog into a cat. Fact 101. And this last fact here is some quotes. Quote, "The Negro's rude ignorance has never invented any effectual weapons of defence or destruction. They appear incapable of forming any extensive plans of government or conquest, and the obvious inferiority of their mental faculties has been discovered and abused by the nations of the temperate zone." That was Edward Gibbon, the great historian and author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, I would say, well, I guess he's saying the nations of the temperate zone. Perhaps he's referring to Arabs there in the Middle East, because I don't think white people have ever abused the Negro. Buying Negroes from other Negroes, taking them away from god-awful Africa where they were eating one another, taking them to America, clothing them, teaching them how to read and write, feeding them, medicating them, finding them gainful employment, picking cotton. That's hardly abusing them, is it? That's treating them well. If the Negro had ever been abused by the white man, as soon as he was freed from slavery, he would have been straight back on the first boat to Africa. But he didn't. He didn't go back to Africa. And when he was in slavery in America, he continued to breed. What animal continues to breed when it's in captivity? Slavery of the Negro by the white man in Africa was a benevolent practice. It certainly was not the way that it's portrayed to people today. And we've got one final quote here, and it's actually the man of the moment. It's Robert E. Lee. Quote, "Wherever you find the Negro, everything is going down around him. And wherever you find the white man, you see everything around him improving."